So I'd like to welcome everybody to the third week of the summer lecture series. Today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Tim Gavin of Purdue University, who will be presenting on physiology of sport and the energy to compete. Some background on Dr. Tim Gavin. He is the professor and the department head of the Department of Kinesiology and Health at Purdue University. I'd like to thank everybody again for taking the time out of your day to join us on this beautiful night. Dr. Gavin, whenever you're ready, could you please share your screen with us?
Well, thanks everyone for being here. So a couple things before we get started. As Gabriel mentioned, I'm Tim Gavin. I'm the head of the Department of Health and Kinesiology here at Purdue University. And a few things that I think we're going to end up talking about here today. So I don't know what your background is, so I'm going to try and hit a little bit of a middle ground, if you will. If I'm totally missing the mark, please say something to me. So we'll talk some about fundamentals of sport and exercise physiology. I'll talk to you a little bit about how muscle uses fuel and how muscle becomes fatigued. We'll discuss some basics of training, and then we'll talk a little bit about body composition. And as opposed to me just talking and going on, I would much rather that we have a conversation or that you ask me a question if it's not being clear. I'm sure Dr. Lopez does the same, which is, I know this, so it always seems like the simplest things, but I know from giving talks like this, what I assume is incorrect. So feel free to jump in or ask me questions or whatever you need to as we go along. All right, so a couple disclaimers. First of all, I'm an exercise physiologist. I'm not a physician. I'm not a biomechanist. I'm not a motor control person. I know some of these pieces, but I don't know them in the same extent as I do exercise physiology. I'm trained in human performance, so I think of human performance in its absolute broadest terms. I think of athletes, and I've worked with athletes, mostly aerobic athletes, mostly cycling, but other aerobic sports as well. But I think of people who we know have struggles moving, and I think about how can we improve their performance? How can we get someone to be able to walk through a grocery store who may struggle to do that on a daily basis? So anywhere from elite athletes, and we've tested some pretty good athletes over the years, to older adults or people with chronic disease conditions, and really trying to think of how we can improve them. And then the last thing I need you to know, I know little anything about rugby. So feel free to jump in, help me out. It is just not a sport that I grew up playing American football and really didn't know much about rugby until I worked with some people from overseas, some Australians and some people from England. And so I got a little bit of it, but I don't know very much. So I apologize in advance. All right. So I need to hold on, just give me a second. I'm going to minimize some of this so I can actually see my screen. So exercise physiology is the study of how bodies, structures, and function. So our structure and our function go hand in hand. Many times people will talk about physiology and anatomy, and it's because structurally it has to be able to function, and for it to function, it must structurally be appropriate for whatever the intention is. So we talk about how these structures and functions are altered when we expose someone to acute exercise. So if you go out today and you do a match, how do you respond? What are all the things that happen? You're going to get hot, you're going to be sweating, you're going to be breathing hard, your heart's going to be pounding. We can talk about all of those mechanisms for how those things happen. But then we also talk about your training. So you're training on a daily basis, right? So you train because you want to see adaptations that hopefully improve your performance. So we also can talk about what are the pieces that lead to training-induced adaptations. And when we talk about exercise, we know things like environmental conditions can be used to help stress the body. So for example, right now I live in Indiana. We are in a heat humidity wave. None of us are ready for the heat that we're getting here in the summer. So we're all going to have to go out and get heat acclimated so that we can start being able to perform better under these high humidity, high temperature conditions. And we adapt. We can do that with people. We can put them in hot rooms. We can train them, these kinds of things, and they will do better in the heat. And then sport physiology is when we take these and apply these exercise physiology concepts and principles and really talk about training and performance. So how much heat exposure do you need to become heat adapted? How do we accomplish that? How do we get you into maybe a cold environment or an altitude-based environment? And how do we do training or expose you to conditions that will help you to maximize your performance? So really, sports physiology is a derivation of exercise physiology. So again, we think about acute responses. How do you respond to one single bout? As I said, if we have you go out to a track and we have you run around and you do 10 laps or 20 laps or something like that, the things we know are going to happen are you're going to be breathing more, your heart's going to be moving more, you're going to be pumping more blood, your muscles are going to be contracting, they're going to be using fuel, that fuel will become depleted in various stores, you will get hot, you will start sweating. These are really easy things for us to know are going to happen when we exercise you. And then again, this chronic adaptation. I always think of stress. What we want to do is stress the body. So when I'm working with athletes or we're talking about helping athletes, I'm always thinking, what are the stresses that they will undergo in a match, in a race? How do we think about those stresses and then get them or impose them during training? So for example, if you need to run really fast, I should probably run you fast in training at some point as opposed to just always having you run slow. If I need you to be pushing big people around, I probably need to think about helping you get stronger so you can push those big people around. So I'm always thinking about what are the tasks needed? How do we develop training to be able to address those specific tasks you need? And we'll talk a little bit more about that here a little later. So the other thing too is if we're training you, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to be monitoring you. Now you especially see these like in the NBA playoffs right now. People have been taking off their jerseys and they've got these catapults or something else. It's a harness. It looks like a sports bra, but it is wired to be able to collect data from them. It can do things like GPS. How far did you run, right? So we have those on athletes here at Purdue so we can track how much did this one athlete run during basketball practice or football practice? How fast were they running when they were running? So we can then start to understand the loads that they're undergoing. And we can think about it from training. We think about training as loads, okay? Time, intensity, frequencies, these things impact load. If you did everything hard every single day, it's too much load, and you eventually could lead to the injuries that I'm sure Dr. Lopez is familiar with and has talked with you about. So we also, when we're trying to think about, we want to control conditions. So if I want to see how fast you are, I want to do it on the same day, right? I want to do it on a day that's maybe 70 degrees outside as opposed to being minus 20 degrees, right? If I want to see how fast you are, we put you out there where it's minus 20 degrees, you're going to be shivering. You are probably not going to run your fastest. So if I'm trying to compare, did we get you faster? I'd like to do those under very similar conditions. So we also want to take account for things like diurnal cycles. We know you're different in the morning than you are in the afternoon, so we're always testing people at the same time of day. If we're trying to understand menstrual function and menstrual cycle impacts, we want to make sure that we're testing our female athletes at the same menstrual phases if we can. And then same times with sleep and eating patterns. Many times the testing we'll do in our lab is we'll do it when you're fasted because then I don't have to worry about what you ate that morning. Or if I'm going to do it a little later in the day, I give you breakfast. Here's what I want you to eat. So many calories based on your size. So that way I'm always testing you and other people in a similar fashion. Then we always think about how are we going to do this. We use ergometers. We could use a rowing ergometer. We could use a treadmill. We could use a bike, right? We could have you lift weights. We could have you use, and I'll show you a picture of one, an isokinetic machine. And then we always want to do testing that is applicable to your activity. So if we take a cyclist and we have them run, their VO2 may not be as good on running as it is on a bike. And if we take a runner and have them do a maximum exercise test on a bike, that runner would probably be better if we did it running. So we want to be testing people in an appropriate manner. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about muscle. So when we think about muscle, most of the time we think about skeletal muscle, but you also have cardiac muscle, your heart, and we also have smooth muscle that helps us control like the airways that we breathe through and our blood blood vessels. So I'm going to talk about skeletal muscle here. And this is just a diagram that shows you how muscle gets broken down. So we can start either place. I can start at the very top here at the bone. We have a tendon that's attached to the muscle, and we've got muscle bundles here and fibers. And eventually it leads us down to a single muscle fiber. All right. So you think of muscle as being this huge thing, but when we study it, we start thinking about how does this intracellular space start to change when we're doing whatever kinds of activity, okay? And this is where we start to have injuries occurring, right? When we have tendinopathies, you have some type of Achilles tendon injury or something. Well, that's going to be impacting tendons connections with the bone and the muscle and lead to negative outcomes. Now, one of the things we talk a lot about is that not every muscle is the same and not every person's muscle is the same. So we have different kinds of muscle. We have some muscle. I would ask a question, so I'm not sure how well these ever work here. I would normally ask a question. So if we were in my classroom, I would ask you, so what kind of muscles do we have? Well, we have big ones and small ones. It's usually one of the fun answers I get pretty quickly. But the other one is we have two types of muscle predominantly. We classify them as type 1 or type 2 muscle fibers. Some people will call them slow muscle fibers and fast muscle fibers. And what we know is that not everybody has the exact same percentage. On average, most of us are 50% type 1 slow and 50% type 2 fast. But when we look at athletes, that's different. So here I've highlighted a couple different. At the bottom, I've noted the non-athletes, which we see both men and women, whether we do the vastus lateralis, which is a muscle on the outside of your thigh, or we do the gastrocnemius, which is your calf muscles. What we see is that these two muscles are pretty similar, and men and women, on average, are 50-50. Now, if we look at runners, so if you ever watch the Olympics, which I'm sure we all have, right? You know, when they talk track and field, you're like, what event? Are we talking about the 100 meters? Or are we talking about the 10,000 meter, right? Those extra two zeros make a big impact. So if we look at sprinters, 100-meter runners, what we see is these are athletes that have a lot of type 2 fibers. And then if we look at endurance athletes, the distance runners, they have a lot of type 1. And what does that tell us? Well, even without knowing what the properties of these muscle types are, what you would say is, what are the characteristics of these people? Well, distance runners, they're really good at running a long time. They're really good aerobic athletes. And that's what we see is they have a lot of type 1s, which are considered aerobic muscle fibers. And then we think of sprinters. Tend to be a little bigger, pretty muscular, and they're really fast. And not are they only fast, they're powerful. And what we see is they have a lot of type 2 fibers. So just by thinking about which type of runner has which kind of muscle fibers tells you something about those muscle fibers. Type 1 slow fibers, they're aerobic. We see them in more aerobic athletes. They don't fatigue as quickly, or they can maintain producing energy at really pretty significant levels for long periods of time. Whereas athletes that have more type 2 fibers, very powerful, very fast, can jump very high, very far. So I'm going to try and not overwhelm with too much science here, but I got to be honest, I really like it. So I have to put a little bit of it in, and I'd be disappointed in myself if I did. All right, so in our muscles, we use a form of energy called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And this is our intracellular energy. We need ATP to contract our muscles, to be able to run fast, jump high, move big weights. We have to have ATP because that's the energy that our muscle fibers use. But we don't eat ATP. What we eat are carbohydrates and proteins and fats. And through our digestive system, and eventually everything gets moved into storage, lipids, or in muscle, we store glucose or sugar in the form of glycogen. And then we use those things to eventually make ATP. And we have to have ATP being made for us to be able to do muscular contraction. So at the end, all the things we eat, unless they're being stored, they're eventually going to end up as ATP. And so we have different energy systems, right? So based upon what we're doing, what tasks we're doing, we use different systems. And these systems allow us to interact and be able to move both short-term and long-term. So the first one we think about is a system called phosphocreatine. So what I have here on the right side is there's some different energy systems. There's a phosphocreatine system, a glycolysis system, and then we have oxidative systems, carbohydrates and fats, okay? what we see is that if we want to do something, and this talks about how fast we can use it, if we need to use something fast, like running or jumping, like if someone said, oh my gosh, I'll give you $1 million if you beat me to the stop sign across the street, I'm going to run as hard as I can. I'm going to be using this really high rate of energy system, this high energy system that allows me to generate ATP really, really, really fast. Now, other people's ATP system may be faster than mine, but I'm going to use my fast system as best I can. Then when I do intermediate types of exercise, maybe I'm going to have to run for like 60 seconds or 90 seconds or something like that. Then I'm going to use this glycolysis system. And then if you said, okay, Tim, I want you to run a marathon. I first of all would close my eyes like I'm doing right now. It's like, really? Seriously? Okay. Well, when I'm running that marathon, I'm going to use a lot of this oxidative stuff. Now, at the same time, if you ever watched a marathon, one of the things you'll see is people sprint at the very end. Well, they were using this system, and then they can still go back and forth between these systems. So we're able to shift between these systems. Now, the problem is these systems have limits. So when we think about PCR, it has a very short limit. If you've ever tried to run as fast as you can for as long as you can, what you realize is at some point you start slowing down. You're starting to slow down because this system, you've used all the energy that you have there. Whereas if you get to really long things like a marathon, we have essentially an unlimited amount of fat. So if you want to run a marathon, you could run it all on fat, just about. Not exactly true, but just about, right? Because we have a really large storage of it. The problem is if we want to run fast, we can't use fat. We have to be using some of these other systems to run faster. So while we have a lot of it, it doesn't help us go as fast. So it's always a trade-off, and we're always able to move back and forth between these systems, and they're never switches. Many times people think, I use one system, I exhaust it. And it's not like the Apollo rockets where you see them like one set of boosters takes you from the Earth into like low orbit, and then another set of boosters takes you the next way. It's not all or nothing. We're using some of these all the time. All right. And the reason I want to talk about fuel and things like this is because they impact fatigue, right? So as we think about athletes, one of the things we're always worried about is that they're going to become fatigued. And when you become fatigued, you get weaker, you get slower, okay? And so the simplest way to think about a fatigue is that it's a decreased ability of muscle to generate force. So if you did one maximum repetition as hard as you can, right? You did it once. If you try to do it again, you're fatigued because you can't do it. You cannot generate that same force again, which means that you are fatigued. So we can experience fatigue in multiple ways, right? So as I just said, we could have you do a really, really hard lift and you're doing a bench press and you barely got it up. And we said, oh, do it one more time. And you can't. You're fatigued. You cannot generate that same amount of force. We could also have you running around the track as fast as you can. And maybe that takes 10 seconds or 20 seconds. Now you slow down. You're fatigued. We could also have you running long distances and you start slowing down. That's fatigue. So we can experience fatigue in multiple different settings. And usually it's going to happen because of one of two things. One is because our nerve transmission can actually fatigue. We can't recruit as many muscle fibers to do the same task. We can start to see changes in how nerves work. And as a result, those impaired nerve responses actually lead to the muscle being fatigued. You can't generate the same amount of force. Then we also see things like fuel supply. If you run out of stored sugars, you slow down. That's where many times people think about, and you'll hear people talk about it in a marathon, they hit the wall. What they did not actually hit a wall. At least I hope that's not what they're referring to. What they did was they ran out of muscle stored sugars. And because of that, that system is now gone. So you are relying upon a fat system, which is a really slow rate at which we make ATP. And when you're making it at a low rate, you can't run very fast. So fuel limits can impact it. But, right, we also see things where the muscle, its acidity can change. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about lactate and lactic acid here. It is not everything people crack it up to be. It is not the cause of every single problem that you see in athletes. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So during sprinting exercises, the easy example, what we see is that your muscle pH, so pH talks about how acidic it is. The lower the pH, the more acidic it is, okay? Your muscle becomes acidic when you're sprinting. And it takes a certain amount of time for that to recover. And what's happening is your body is producing high levels of lactate. Now, here's one of the myths about lactate. I only make it during high intensity exercise. False. You are making lactate right now. I might be making a little bit more because I'm pretty excited getting a chance to talk with y'all here. But you are making lactate right now, okay? And it's not because you don't have enough oxygen. You got plenty of oxygen around. You can do aerobic work, but it's just the system's always running. What happens is you're producing it at the same rate you're able to pull it back out. So if I look at your lactate in your blood, the levels don't change while you're at rest, even though you're making it, but you're also pulling it back because lactic acid is a hydrogen ion, which is related to pH, and then lactate. Lactate is energy. It's broken down from sugar, and we can use it to actually generate more ATP. Your heart loves lactate. It actively picks up lactate and helps turn it into ATP. So the problem we're running into is your muscle becoming acidic. And when it becomes acidic, it starts to slow down the rate at which we can make ATP. And if we slow down that rate of ATP, you're going to slow down. It can get so bad that eventually you have to stop. And when that happens, it results in fatigue. So we can see nerve fatigue. We can see inside the muscle fatigue due to fuel substrate availability as well as acidity that can happen with lactate. And one of the things we do with training, right? One of the things we work with the athletes I've worked with is we want you to be able to not produce less lactate. We want you to be able to clear it really easily. So we're not just looking at producing less, we're also wanting you to be able to clear it. And so we see really high lactate clearance rates in really well-trained. All right, so I mentioned the fact that fuel matters. And when we run out of carbohydrates, we slow down, okay? We use carbohydrates to do a huge amount of all the exercise that we do. We use a lot of stored carbohydrates in the form of glycogen when we do running as well as when we're doing lifting. So everybody talks about, oh, I need to eat proteins because I'm lifting. You better make sure you got enough carbohydrates in your diet because that's the energy. Those carbohydrates end up being the ATP that you use to be able to lift more weights. All right. So one of the things we know, and these are studies, if I remember correctly, these are actually supported by Gatorade. So when I think about a carbohydrate drink, think about regular good old Gatorade. What you see is that if you're exercising people here at about 90 minutes and you then give them a Gatorade or a sugary drink, whatever it is, they're able to restore their power output. Whereas someone who was given just an artificial sweetener drink, they continue to get worse. Their power output goes down. So giving people energy while they're exercising is beneficial because it can reduce fatigue. And what we're starting to see now is one of the big areas for research, one of the big things that's leading to big performances in aerobic athletes is we've learned that your gut actually can adapt to more sugars. So by training your gut to consume more sugars on an hourly basis, you now can have more carbohydrates available and prevent this fatigue from occurring. The other thing is we want people to eat high carbohydrate diets. I do. I think there's health benefits to it in spite of what you hear on some of these podcasts or whatever. But athletes need carbohydrates. We use them all the time when we're exercising. We did a study where we looked at how much carbohydrate you use when you're doing regular lifting. You use a lot of it. We saw people using 25 to 35% of their carbohydrate stores, their glycogen, when they did regular lifting exercises, right? We know it's true when people are doing like marathons. So here, based upon, they had 3 different groups, a high carbohydrate diet group, a normal carbohydrate group, and then they put someone on some low carbohydrate groups. And what you see, based upon the initial amount of muscle glycogen, this is that stored sugar I was talking about. These people exhausted around 60 minutes, whereas the people on the high carbohydrate went nearly 3 hours. So it's the difference between 3 hours and 1 hour before they became fatigued. Being on a hard, and training, I think too, it's like if you're training hard, you're always on a high carbohydrate diet. So I'm always thinking the 60, 70% carbohydrates for individuals. Now, I've also worked with elite athletes, and I've worked with athletes getting ready for Ironman Hawaii triathlons. They're training so much, they're like going through 10,000 calories a day, right? It's really hard to eat 10,000 calories of salad. It's exhausting. So they will be eating more, probably less carbohydrates percentile wise, but they're getting so many calories back, it works okay for them. But it's just something we've learned working with athletes at different levels and with different kinds of events. All right, so that's my spiel on fatigue, and hopefully it made sense what I was talking about and gave you a little bit of insight and got you thinking a little bit about why do people become fatigued. Now, one of the ways that we can help people prevent becoming fatigued earlier is through training. So there's several principles of training that I think about when I'm training athletes, and as you work with athletes or you're an athlete yourself, you should be thinking about, right? Individuality. People adapt at different rates and they handle loads differently. Now, that's really hard to do on team sport events, right? It's really hard to have all of your rugby team, even though you have different positions and you may train the different positions differently, all of your forwards are going to be, forward is a position. I probably am wrong there. I'm speaking off the cuff and I apologize, but they're the same position. Like, you're going to train them all the same way. But these individuals may respond differently or may be able to hand different loads differently. So we really think about, if you can think about individuals, there's a way to do it that benefits the individual athletes. Specificity, training people in the things they want to do. If I want you to run fast, I better train you running, not riding a bike or rowing in the lake, right? Specificity of training. What is it that you need to be able to do? And let's train that specifically. Keep in mind reversibility, right? So athletes become detrained. When an athlete gets injured, one of the biggest questions we have is how do we limit the detraining that's going to happen when they're injured? Because we know that gains made through training are reversible. And this is one of my favorite shots. I can't remember where I got this from, but this is Arnold Schwarzenegger. Now, this is still many years ago. This is when he was Mr. Universe, right? And this is when he was the governor of California. Clearly, he doesn't look the same. Why? He's not training the same. Also, taking anabolic steroids, but still, having that muscle, if you don't maintain it in the same fashion of training that you had done in the past, it's going to change. And that's what we see is people detrain when they detrain, they start to see reversals of the benefits they have there. And with training now, with injuries, we think so much about it. We think about, what are the things we can do to help that? Can we do lightweight lifting? Some people think more about like blood flow restricted lifting. So now you're not putting as much absolute force on a joint, but that you may, because you're limiting blood flow to the muscles, may get some of the same benefits you would get with full load training. We put people in gravity bags, right? And put them on the treadmill so some of their weight is lifted off. We can put them in pools. In our pools now, in our sport medicine suite, we can raise or lower them based upon how much of their body weight we want them to carry while they're still running. Why? Because maybe they have a stress fracture and we're trying to let that heal, but we're trying to limit the detraining that's going to occur. So we're always thinking about that with injury. And then other principles are progressive overload, right? You don't start doing your mid-season workout as soon as you get done with the off-season, right? You have to work your way back up to that. That's a progressive. And good coaching has you go and get more and more training, and then always gives you chance for rest. So I always think about hard and easy, and I always talk to athletes, and athletes are horrible about this, right? If you have a bad performance, every athlete's first response is, I need to train harder. And that may not be the case. It's really hard to work with athletes to think about two things. You really need to train hard, and you really need to train easy. Training easy is hard. Like, you really have to get good at going easy, because it's when we go easy that we start to see adaptation. If we do hard all the time, people will get better, but then eventually they'll start getting worse because there's no time to recover. And it's that recovery period when we build more muscle, when we build more mitochondria, when we get bigger, faster, stronger. And then we can periodize their training. Right? So we're going to do certain things during pre-training will be different than early season, that may be different than late season, that may be different than than when they're getting ready to be in the Olympics, where we're tapering them down. So every training week, month is not the same. And even in elite athletes, based upon what their long-term goals are, keeping in mind something like the Olympics only comes about every 4 years, maybe different years are trained differently. So then we're always thinking about these athletes, what do they need? So what muscle groups or activity is going to be trained, we're the ones they use, right? So we even train, we didn't used to do this, but we now train runners to do more upper body work. We don't want them to gain muscle, but we want them to be stronger, as well as lower body work, because we want them to be stronger, right? Helps us reduce their injury risks. What types of training? Should we be doing sprint training? Should we be doing endurance training? Should we be doing weightlifting? Should we be doing balance training? training? What are the things that we need to train on? Maybe it's skills. Maybe there are certain skills, like, I don't know, the scrum, I think it's called, like, whoever pushes whoever up to reach all the way up and grab the ball, like, that feels like it's going to take a little bit of practice, right? So sometimes your practice is skill based and not getting you bigger, faster, stronger. What energy systems are you going to use? If you look at different pieces of, like in soccer, midfielders are running a lot of medium speed stuff. You got strikers sprinting harder. So what kind of training do you need to do, and what kind of energy systems are being in play there? Because not everybody's running the same speed all the time. And then what are we training, and how can it help us prevent injuries? Where are we really worried about it, right? We're just, I was just talking, we just had students go over to Ireland for 2 weeks of sports medicine study abroad trip. And what's interesting is that in Ireland, the number one injury is hamstrings. I don't know why. And the students I talked to didn't seem to know why. Whereas in the US, based upon the kind of sports we play, lots of hands injuries. And the thought was the Irish athletes do a lot of skill training that the US athletes don't. So that's why you see some of the differences in which muscle groups or which limbs or whatever might be impacted more with injury. And then you have to think about designing training programs, things to decide. What exercises are you going to have someone do? Are you going to have them sprint? You're going to have them do long distance? How will you do them, right? So when I think about athletes over a course of a week, I like to do harder things early where you really have to be explosive, right? If I'm going to do sprint training, I'm going to do it early in the week before you start to get accumulated fatigue. Because sprinting is fast, 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 fast. And if you're really, really tired, you don't sprint very fast, and you're not really learning very much, and you're not training very well if you're already really, really, really tired. So the order in which you're going to perform them, either during the course of the day, right? One of the things we talk about basketball. When do you want people to shoot free throws? When they're tired. Because those are the free throws that count, right? Yeah, every point counts, but it's at the end of the game when you're down by one, and you need these 2 free throws. So you want people to be shooting free throws when they're tired so that they feel comfortable doing it. So that's some of the psychology, but it's also some of the physiology, some of the motor control, some of the biomechanics. How many repetitions do they do? Are we going to, everybody's always, there is no track runner, if anybody you've ever run track. Distance runners are never happy with sprinters. Why? Because their data is like, what did you do? I did 4 starts and I did like 450 meters. What did you do? I ran 10 miles, right? How many reps, how many sets, how many starts, how many this, how many that? You have to figure those things out. How many reps in a set? How many sets do you do? Do you do 1? Do you do 2? Do you do 10? How much rest between them? The more rest you give, the more recovery you see. And if you're trying to do maximum efforts, right? I would always tell sprinters, I don't want you to sprint again really quickly. I want you to take some time so that you can sprint really fast, right? So maybe it's 10 minutes or 8 minutes or 5 minutes between. Whereas if we're really trying to work on someone's fatigue, we're like, okay, 10 seconds, let's go again. 10 seconds, let's go again. So are we working on the fatigue, or are we working on all maximum speeds? And then what's the intensity, right? How hard are we going to be doing these? What is the goal? Why are we trying to do that, right? So intensity, velocities of movements, and then how many workout days per week? Elite athletes tend to be close to 7, but when I've trained athletes, I always give them some easy days. And one of the things, and again, if you get into coaching, right, there's physiology, there's mechanics, there's neural control, but there's a lot of psychology. Training professional athletes, they're under a lot of stress. They're training, I'm trying to stress them, but I'm also always talking to them about what else they have going on in their life. Do they have class? Do they have a big exam coming up? Are they in a relationship? So I try to make sure that we're always paying attention to outside stressors that would impact the physiological stressors that I'm trying to impose. And the only ones I really have control over, right? Repetition sets, all those things. But I'm also very conscious of, if you have a steady boyfriend, girlfriend, okay, why don't you on Mondays, like Mondays was always one of my big rest days because people have more time on the weekend generally. Monday, why don't you go out to dinner with your boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, whatever, right? Go see a movie on Monday. Monday's an easy day. Do these things when you don't feel fatigued, when you're not overwhelmed by the training, so that you can have this life balance. Because having happy athletes, having well-rounded athletes leads to really good performances. And again, individual adaptations. People adapt at different rates and respond to training differently based upon their genetics. So don't assume if it worked for someone, it's going to work for the next person. Or don't assume because your star athlete can handle it and your second teamer or your third teamer can't, That's why they're elite athletes sometimes, right? Elite athletes are because they can handle all the stress. But if you're injuring your second and third teamers, you better hope something doesn't happen to your first teamer, because now you are in real trouble. So think about people as individuals when you can. And then training terminologies, you can undertrain people. You can just not do enough training and those people show up. It's just like an exam. If you don't study, everybody wants to do well at the race. But if you didn't train, you're not going to do well. Just like an exam. If you didn't study, you're not going to do well in the exam. So you got to do the hard work ahead of time so that when it comes to the day of performance, you're able to bring it. So then we always are thinking of overloading people, right? If I want you to get bigger, faster, stronger, I have to push you a little, right? I have to make you tired so that your body says, whoa, I do not like that. What will I do to prevent that fatigue from happening? I will build more muscle so that I am stronger and I will not be fatigued. So we always are thinking, how do we keep overloading people to try and make sure that we're always seeing gains? Then we can have real periods of heavy overload where we said, look, we know we're going to be piling it onto you, but then you're going to get a nice break. And then we're going to do a couple more weeks of training after that, and you will be at peak form. So sometimes we're actually really pushing you hard. And it's hard. It's hard to do. It's hard to know. That takes practice, and it takes working with athletes to understand what they can and can't tolerate. And then this really, in elite athletes, you have a greater chance of this, but in most of us, we don't see that much, is overtraining. Because like myself, I still train. I just don't have time. I got a job. I got to go to my job. I got a family, right? I got dogs that got to get fed, and go to the vet, and go to the car, take the car, get the car oil changed, the tires rotated, whatever. So I can't train as much as I want because I have other obligations. So for most of us, the average everyday Joe athlete, overtraining is not a problem. But when we start talking about elite athletes, when we start talking about people who are really dedicated to their sport, who have the time to put into it, 20 hours a week, 40 hours a week, those kinds of things, then we have to be really sensitive to overtraining. And then training demands. If we increase the duration, frequency of training, this leads to an increase in volume, not more than 10% a week, right? So people used to take all this time off when they got done with their season. That doesn't happen anymore. Most of the athletes will take a week off and then they're back at it. Why? Because they're going to start ramping up slowly. And then intensity determines adaptation. If you want to run slow, train slow. If you want to run fast, train fast. The faster you train, the harder you train, the more you're pushing the system, the faster you'll be. And then we can think of strength gains, right? On average, most people will gain about 30% strength if we put them into a resistance training program. Okay. Now that strength, everybody thinks, oh, it's because I got so much bigger. Oh, no, no, no. One of the things we do is we learn how to lift weights better. That's why we get stronger. We learn to fire muscles at certain times, and that gets us stronger. So most of the adaptations we see in like 12 weeks is due to neural gains. And we're starting to see some muscle gain. And that's why when people say, man, I got really strong when I first started, and then all of a sudden I didn't get very strong anymore. Well, you maximized your neural gains here, and now you're only dealing with muscle hypertrophy or bigger muscle gain. And that just takes time to build, and it takes a long, gradual process. So don't let people be discouraged when they said, I was gaining so much strength the first 4 weeks. Yeah, it's because you learned how to lift those weights better. And the last thing I think I'll talk about tonight, I think it's my last thing, is body mass and body composition. So really, we think about body composition. There's fat mass. You add those together, you get your body, okay? Fat mass is just what it is, say it is. Everything else is fat-free mass. Add those together, that's your body mass. But we really want to be conscious of maximizing fat-free mass, right? We want people to maximize them for whatever we're thinking about, strength, power, muscular endurance, those kinds of things. And we're trying to reduce, for the most part, minimize relative body fat. But keep in mind, there's a lot of differences between sports. And different sports will have different body composition. So when we look at elite aerobic athletes, we've tested people, we're seeing them like 4% body fat, which is not what most people are. And that's not, a lot of professional athletes based upon their sport are not that way. But in a sport where your power to body weight ratio is really important, we see those low things. And there's a host here. So what we can see is, here's rugby here, 6 to 16%. This is before women were playing. And you can see different sports here. Bodybuilding pretty low. I know I had running on here. Running can be very low. So rugby seems to be pretty consistent with a lot of aerobic sports that we see there. And then always think about appropriate weight guidelines. If you're coaching people, and different people are more sensitive than others. We see more eating disorders in women than we see in men, but we do see eating disorders in men, right? You really have to be thinking about who this person is, and you're not trying to make them to be an athlete they're never going to be. So you always want to be conscious about appropriate weight guidelines for that individual. And so in summary, we've talked about muscles and tendons and connective tissue, learned about ATP and how we supply ATP to do work. We talked about fatigue and neural and fuel supply and acidity things that can impact fatigue. We talked about muscle strength. Those are due to both nerve activation and muscle hypertrophy. And that body composition should be thought of as maximizing performance and not just trying to make some target weight because that's what someone thinks that is the right amount. And those types of things where you say every runner has to be at this, not every runner has to be at that. You really want athletes, and some athletes perform better when they have a little bit more body fat. They just do. So you really have to be conscious of it and thinking about those individuals. And that's what I had.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Gavin, for that excellent presentation. It was wonderful, very knowledgeable things that you taught us today. Very interesting as well. I would now like to open the floor to any questions. If maybe Dr. Lopez or anybody from the group has any questions. If anything, I would like to start them off. Dr. Gavin, I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to limit it to just a few. One of the things that I find really interesting is when I was going or studying exercise science, I heard about something being an interference effect between lifting and running. Right now, my training has to do with both lifting and running for military purposes, but I wanted to ask you if there's any benefit or if it's actually detrimental, because they told me that it's not as good as if you were to periodize, let's say, endurance blocks or strength building blocks. Is it all right to, I guess, do both at the same time? Like, can it be done with proper programming to achieve progress in both goals concurrently?
Yes, you can. We think of it as concurrent training. So yes, you can. We do it with athletes all the time. If you said I really had to maximize only one thing, then perhaps being very specialized. But what we see is that let's think of runners here. We never think of runners lifting weights. Why would a distance runner lift weights? Well, we want to prevent them from getting injured, right? We want them to be stronger, which doesn't mean they have to have a lot of muscle, but we get a lot of strength from neural gain. And that's real strength. You can really apply those neural gains. So yes, you can. If you're really trying to maximize, like if you wanted to be, a bodybuilder or something, you probably would more maximize it. But the piece you run into is aerobic exercise can burn calories at a much higher rate than weight training can. And when we think about I think when you look at some of the military recommendations, everything, you're doing both. And when we clearly think about people being as healthy as possible, we want people to be doing both endurance exercise and muscle strengthening exercise.
Got it. Thank you so much. I have a second question. Sorry. You also mentioned that we could train to become more efficient at flushing out. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology. But flushing out and resisting the effect of lactic acid. I don't know if you could possibly explain, or if you could please explain how we could incorporate that kind of training, or if you give us like a practical example. Is there any exercises that are best for that? Let's say for running, or let's say for strength training.
Yeah, what we see is that if you're running at a very moderate pace, you're producing more lactate, but you're also able to remove it from the blood. So we think of it as lactate clearance. So there's lactate production and lactate clearance. By doing high intensity work, you are improving that clearance rate. So by when we're doing just really moderate level work, doesn't really push that envelope. But when we see people and start to incorporate high intensity work, interval training, things like this, because you're generating that lactate, we also start to see that the clearance rates also improve.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
I'd actually like to raise a question, Dr. Gavin. First of all, great presentation. I thought one interesting note you made was that there is a lot of information given out on podcasts, and not all of it is necessarily correct, but it does look like that is where a lot of people do get their information from, social media, podcasting, or just by word of mouth with peers. Do you have any advice for people who mainly get their information from those sources, trying to differentiate what is fact versus rumor, or what is science-based versus just a jump to conclusions?
Yeah, it's difficult. Thanks for the questions. And it's difficult. One of the things I always think of, if someone's promoting a product, I question, that feels like a conflict of interest, right? So if they're promoting a product as part of this, that says that I would really question that. There's a lot of science out there, and I would argue anyone who really wants to know what the science is, there's plenty of resources. One of the places I go to regularly, and I use this a lot, is the NIH runs a searchable engine called PubMed, and that will pull up refereed articles. They've been peer reviewed, and so that can give you some really great advice. What works for someone too doesn't work for everyone. And they many times don't tell you every other thing that's going on. They might say, it's this one thing I did. Oh, I added this to my diet, and that was the difference. They don't tell you all the other things they were doing at the same time. So it's just difficult. I think you have to get to a point where I don't think having a PhD or having training, scientific based training, whether you're an RD or a scientist or a physician like Dr. Lopez, where you have all this training, is the only way for people to be knowledgeable. But it clearly speaks to the potential for that. But there are people who are in my field who I don't agree with, and I'm sure Dr. Lopez has that same outcome as well, that you don't. So it's a really difficult one, and the volume is just so high. I wish I had a great way to tell you how to differentiate them, but it's really hard.
Thank you.
Can everyone introduce themselves and advise what university you're at, so this way, or institutions Dr. Gavin knows? Thank you. Any other questions?
I got a question, Dr. Lopez. Hey, Dr. Gavin, thank you for the great presentation. My name is Ritvik. I'm a rising senior at Georgia Tech. So my question is, it's about like the wearables that are on the market. So the top wearable on the market for like high performing athletes is Whoop, like the Whoop band. And like some of the top athletes I follow, like Cristiano Ronaldo and LeBron James, like wear these and promote these. So they use a various inputs and generate recovery scores. So my question to you is like, in your experience and what you've seen from your athletes, do you think that like the inputs that it uses, which are important, which can be misleading, and do you think wearables like these are good for the field of exercise physiology? And do you recommend like even an average exerciser to get them? And what are your thoughts on the overall tech wearable market?
Well, they're expensive and they require a continuous subscription. So that always bothers me, making a recommendation that says you should spend money. I would always ask too is if Cristiano Ronaldo would wear it if they didn't pay him. At the same time, I think the principles they talk about are valuable, right? And they're getting at these principles we would talk about. Like I didn't talk today about sleep. Sleep's hugely important, right? And so a lot of these, you're wearing them all the time, so they're tracking your sleep. It's difficult to get at how good that sleep was, but even just a sheer volume number, like I got so many hours, like I track how many hours of sleep I get every night. And I'm probably adding in quality there. So I can do that. I just do it on an Excel spreadsheet. And I was like, whoa, I was not doing a good job sleeping last week. So maybe that's what's been impacting what it is. So I think you can track a lot of these things yourself without these devices. Devices probably make them easier to track. The other struggle we always run into is, well, how do you get whatever number you say that is? Oh, you're at a 12 today, right? Like Whoop, I think uses 0 to 20 numbers. You're at 18. What is that? How do you get to 18? And unfortunately, many times that's proprietary. I can't tell you how I got that. So it's like, what are the variables? But if we know those variables, which are some of the variables we talked about here, you can track these things yourselves. And truly too, talk a lot with the athletes, right? So are there value? Absolutely. I think they're fun. I love data. So I think having more data is always fun. I do a lot of cycling now. I have a power meter. I'm checking that sucker like, oh, how much did I do? How high intensity? What was the duration? It comes up, calculates you these training stress scores, like how much is it? What does it mean? And like those are a little bit more open. And many things will track those kinds of things. So I love wearables. I think it's the place it's going to be. That's the catapults, like I told you. Those are more the professional. And you can see it if you ever see someone with a little bump on the back of their jersey. You're like, wow, dude, I would have thought you had a better, like, that's not very good tailoring. You're like, oh no, that's their catapult sticking up a little bit there. It's really, yeah, so we can collect a large amount of data. Now, I think the other cool thing that's going to come out of that, sorry, I have long answers usually. My apologies. I should have said that ahead of time. Is like all the data you collect, like how do you use it? These are conversations we're having with some of the sports scientists here at athletics is, well, yeah, you collected 40,000 pieces of data on that person in an hour-long practice. What's valuable? And then the struggle you run into, and this is where you run into, and you can see it in the EPL or La Liga or wherever. Whoa, nope, that's our data. That's our equation, right? So I'm working, you could be working with this athlete and say, oh, yeah, we found measuring these things. This tells us if they're tired or they're ready for training or they need to get a break or whatever. But we're not going to share it with you because that's an advantage to us. We spent all this money. We paid Dr. Lopez and Dr. Gavin to help us figure all this stuff out. We're sure as heck not just going to give it to you for free. So that's the other piece is a lot of the data that you see being talked about is viewed as proprietary by teams and to give them advantages. But I think it's really neat stuff. It'd be really interesting to see as I've come along in my career. I still remember the first heart rate monitor I ever saw, right? Not owned because I couldn't afford it because I was a poor graduate student, but it was like you put it on your wrist. It was about this size, right? It was like this on my wrist. And it did one thing, told you what your heart rate was. You're like, what time of the day is it? I don't know. How long was your heart at that time? I don't know. Does it have a stopwatch? No. I got a stopwatch on this wrist. That's all it did. So the fact that now we can collect all kinds of data and variables, awesome.
Thank you for your answer.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Go ahead, Lucy.
Hi, Dr. Gavin. Thanks for a great presentation. My name is Dr. Lucy Dawson. I just graduated from the Howard University College of Medicine.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was a long road. My question for you is kind of talking about biometric data. You mentioned being able to relate that to the menstrual period. And so I was just curious what you could tell us about what you've learned about how the menstrual cycle can influence athletes and their training.
It influences different athletes differently. What you see is that in big general terms, there's not a huge amount of difference. If we look at Olympic and world records being set, these get set at each of the different menstrual phases they have been. But different women, it's just their menstrual cycles are different and the amount of fatigue and the amount of pain they experience is different. And it's going to be different for those individual athletes. And when we look at so many variables, there are differences, but they tend not to be huge differences. Now, the problem we run into, Dr. Dawson, is, well, we took a group and we gave you the average. And on the average, it didn't seem to have much. But we don't do that we're really not as much on that individual basis. And that's where you probably would see the most differences is some women being really sensitive to it. Difficult to imagine someone having effective training if they're having severe menstrual cramps. Just would be very difficult. That is not a time when I've had athletes who've had that. That's just not a time where I'm very aware that that's not going to be good training. So let's think about how that training impacts that person, right? In other women, not very severe and just doesn't, it's not a point they really have a conversation with me about.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Go ahead, Minna, please.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mina Ko, and I'm a rising senior in high school. I was wondering, like, do athletes with more type 1 or type 2, like, muscle fibers, do they need, like, a different amounts or, like, different timings for carbohydrates based on, like, what kind of sports they do?
Typically, like, we really don't, honestly, we don't push sprinters very hard because we want them to be fast. So we don't need them to expend huge amounts of energy. We just need them to expend huge amounts of energy in a very high rate, right? But what we do know is if we want to keep people at top of their glycogen levels, the best opportunity to do that is immediately post-exercise. So we have an enzyme called glycogen synthase that operates highest post-exercise. So that's when we'll be giving athletes carbohydrates, probably more a little bit a blend of simple and more complex carbohydrates post-exercise during this 15 to 1 hour window where glycogen synthase is doing the most. But then we would also be basing it upon what we thought their energy expenditure would be, right? So if we have a distance runner, we're thinking someone who went out and ran 15 miles, that's a lot of energy expenditure versus a sprinter who maybe did a few hundreds or 200s or what have you in some sprints and everything, maybe lifted some, but their total energy expenditure is probably going to be lower. But that window is still going to be the same time frame.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes, Indira, go ahead, please.
Good evening, Dr. Gavin. My name is Indira Peaks. I'm a rising computer science major at Adelphi University. And my question is, how do you work with other professionals, like, for example, nutritionists, strength coaches, and psychologists to support athlete holistically?
Well, I think you hit it right at the nail right on the head, which is you have to have a holistic approach. I think old school, and I'm old, right? I tended to be that one person, right, who did everything. Based upon the resources available, it depends on levels, right? If you're working at a Ronaldo, no problem having their own nutritionist. And I think you're always communicating and making sure you're always on the same thing. I think the same thing applies for athletes as it does, and I'm sure Dr. Dawson and Dr. Lopez can speak to this, right? Holistic care of our patients, right? We need to make sure that all of our specialists are talking to each other and that we're sharing what's going on because people come in with different pieces. So yeah, we want people to be working on a regular basis because otherwise they always think there's a problem if it's not. So I think really thinking about and being communicative is the thing that really makes the biggest impact is talking to the other people who are on the team, right? Based upon the team. So here at Purdue, we hire, what are we up to now? I think we're up to like 4 sports nutritionists, and we've got a strength and conditioning staff of about 12 or so. And then we have our whole sports medicine team, right? Each sport has each sport has their own athletic trainer, and then football has multiple just because there's so many athletes on the football teams. And then we have 2 physicians who work full time just for athletics. So it's regular communication and having good relationships that matters tremendously. That facilitates the best for the student athlete or the student patient based upon where they are.
Thank you.
All right, thank you everybody for your wonderful and thoughtful questions. Dr. Lopez, if you would like to add anything today.
I do have a couple questions. I thought, or points maybe. I guess. Thank you, Dr. Gavin, for joining us. Obviously, but more importantly, I want to ask, what is your opinion? Obviously, in the ATPPC cycle with supplementation of creatinine, because I think the unique thing is that it was trendy, then it lost favor, then came back, and I believe it's now back in prevalence being used. And I'd have to say the only way that I had gained weight, I was biking, swimming, judo, and rugby in high school. The only way I gained the weight was when I started taking creatinine. I just couldn't because of the amount of energy I was burning the entire time. So
I think it's
ask your opinion on it.
I think it's a pretty consistent response, but that response depends upon also doing the training.
Yeah.
Right. So just taking creatinine is not creatine supplementation, excuse me. Creatine supplementation by itself doesn't do anything, but having with the training, it does have it's not a huge effect, right? Its effect it's documented and it's a consistent effect, but it's not as much of effect as having good training. So having good training and having that supplement can be beneficial. The other one that has gotten more attention recently is, as we talk about acids, bicarbonate, right? So anybody, if you've ever taken a Tums, like you can buy them at the store, they're calcium bicarbonate. It's a buffer. It buffers acids, and you take it because your stomach's acidic. That's why you feel so bad. So you take it, your stomach feels better because the bicarbonate combines with the acid and it makes water, and you're happy, happy, joy, joy. Okay. So the problem with bicarbonate is it is effective in helping us buffer acidity, but it can be really GI distressful. So people have to be very cautious to think like, oh, I'm going to have more bicarbonate. be cautious because it can cause a lot of GI distress. And so you have to be cautious with using it. Now, there's more formulas coming out now that seem to buffer some of these, some nutritional products that seem to suggest that, and you're seeing more elite athletes using these nutritional products. But if you're just sitting there and using baking soda, which is sodium bicarbonate, that you can buy at the grocery store, and it's in everybody who cooks or bakes, you start eating it by the spoonful, don't get far from the restroom.
All right, thank you on that. Another point I wanted to bring up, I think young Miss Mina was trying to allude to it, and I guess it's your training adaptations, and you kind of dabbled into it briefly. You can have training adaptations by training programs, but now let's go to the molecular level, and how about training adaptations for each energy system?
Yes, each energy system is responsive to specific types of training. So if I would like to be better in the phosphocreatine, the PCR system, I need to be doing high intensity exercise. Me just doing long, slow runs doesn't impact the PCR system. So if I need that system to be more active, I need to be doing those higher intensity types runs. Likewise, doing just sprinting doesn't lead to the adaptations we see in aerobic athletes. And most of them are derived around more mitochondria in your muscle is one of the big adaptations. And so doing more aerobic work can lead to more mitochondria, more powerhouses, more ATP producers. So yes, we are sensitive to it. And so by having different types of training built in, we can try and maximize each of those systems.
I'd be amiss if I didn't bring up, now when we rehab and return players to sport, we're looking at it from the molecular standpoint of the healing of the tissue. How about returning them back to the, I guess, the energy systems that they were pre-injured? And do you see that you're tailoring that now more so as a physiologist?
Yeah, you're definitely thinking about it, and that's where I think we probably do as much work. Most of the sports we do involve running or being on your legs.
Sure.
So most of the things that we're doing, and we can hold adaptations pretty well. If we go from, and Dr. Dawson, Dr. Lopez will have these timelines better than I would, right? But if we have someone undergo an ACL surgery, or if it's something much less severe, trying to get them back and being mobile while we're trying to reduce the inflammation that's occurring, but also trying to get range of motion back, as well as trying to prevent those. We're seeing more of these athletes. I mean, we put athletes either in the gravity, which is like a big, huge tent that goes around a treadmill.
It would take around 250 days for an ACL, but go ahead.
Yeah. So really trying to think about ways that we can limit the amount of detraining that's occurring, because we can hold on to some of the adaptations for some period of time, but trying to get them to be moving back more and trying to limit the detraining that you see there. I think trying to specifically do it, the struggle would be not allowing adequate healing. So I think it's a real strong, and I'm not a big, I don't do a ton of with the rehab side. I think more so our sports medicine docs, our athletic trainers are much more engaged in that. And I'm just not that knowledge base, but clearly having conversations about, could we measure some of these things? We absolutely could. And being able to identify, okay, for an aerobic athlete, how much of their aerobic capacity did they lose? Well, we could do things like that in the treadmill or in the anti-gravity skirt, right? We could still run those kinds of tests and see where they are if we know what they were before. Give us some sense of how far they've gone. We do see people tend to rebound faster if they were trained before, right? So their rates of recovery. So if we train someone, detrain them, and train them again, that rate to get back to where they were is a little bit quicker than someone who was doing it from a naive state. So there is a little bit of muscle memory that comes into play here as well.
Yeah, I think what happens is that when you're dealing with these high level athletes, and this is what occurred when I was dealing with the Northeast Olympic Development Academy, you deal with these athletes who are so fine tuning their bodies, diets, how they approach things, that they're micromanaging every aspect of it for performance. And I think what happens is that you alluded to something very, very important. One player kept presenting with almost overuse injuries, but we knew that they weren't until we finally started honing in on them. And we found out they were conditioning themselves outside of our program, even more so that they ended up with your stress fractures, the overuse injuries that we were concerned with. And we were wondering how were they encountering this compared to other athletes. So you have to know when these things start popping up, you need to know that they're out of the ordinary. And these athletes are probably pushing themselves, as Dr. Gavin did allude to. They're going to push themselves because they don't know any better. They think they need to train harder. And meanwhile, they need to rest more. And I guess the question I have for you, Dr. Gavin, how do you tell these players, look, you're doing the best you can. You can take, like The Rock, you can take a pizza day off. You can take, and I think he emphasizes that on his social media. And I thought that was one of the best things to say. It's okay to take a day off, because if you don't, like you said, Dr. Gavin, if you don't take that Monday off, they won't reboot. The athlete won't reboot to the same they need to be.
Yeah. I always think train hard, rest hard. That's what I start with. Train hard, rest hard. Like, do the workouts that we have designed, because we're thinking in our minds, right? We're thinking, what is the load we're imposing based on volume, intensities, rest times, all these things? Because we're thinking about what adaptation will that lead to. But if you decide, if it's this idea, and it's really easy because competitive athletes have they tend to be type A people. And if some is good, more has to be better. It just has to be. And it is a vicious loop they get themselves in, and they just get worse and worse, and they can't understand it. And then their mental space is really challenging, because they just it is they, as you were saying, Dr. Lopez, this is who they see themselves as. They see themselves as this athlete, not as Tim or Victor or Gabriel or Mina. They see themselves as elite athlete. And so it's really, we have to be very conscious of it. And it's good lines of communication, but that's easier said than done.
It is. I'll conclude with one manuscript that we came across and just came out not too long ago. And what do you think about, obviously, as a physiologist, the breath holding for swimming and diving and, to improve athletic endurance, but application in other sports? Because that's what I want to ask you.
Yeah.
Do you see the benefit of that, or have you heard much about it?
I don't think it has much benefit. The piece, and these are some of these things, and we can all, we talk about this if you ever had stats class, cause and correlations and causes, right? So if you look at elite swimmers, they tend to have larger lung capacities. Whereas if you look at elite runners, they have the same lung capacity as anybody else their size. So the question then gets to be, well, so then people ask, is it because these swimmers are they're not breathing freely? They breathe a lot, but they're not breathing freely because they're only doing it as the stroke permits. The other way to think about it is, if you want to be an elite swimmer, is one of the physiological characteristics you need big lungs, because your lungs are buoyancy. They keep you on top of the water. So if you have larger lungs, they keep you on top of the water. That's a benefit. So is it that the swimming causes the large lungs, or is it someone who has larger than normal lung size for their size? Does that help them be an elite swimmer? So which one's the chicken and which one's the egg? Difficult questions to answer. But when we look at other athletes, they don't inherently have large lung capacities. Our lungs are like our lungs adapt, but structurally do not adapt to exercise. We're able to diffuse more oxygen across. We have other things happening, but it's still structurally pretty rigid in there. One, you only got so much thoracic cavity there to squeeze all that in. So that's one way to think about it. But it doesn't seem to be the correlate. And we have athletes, and we've tested them. I did some of this work 20, 30 years ago now. There are some athletes who breathe a lot. We would say they really try to defend their blood oxygen levels. And then we have other athletes, and probably some of the most elite athletes, who at really high aerobic intensities do not protect their oxygen levels. They let them fall, not to dangerous levels, but relative to what you and I would be at. So like when I got tested, right, my oxygen levels really don't change from rest to maximum exercise because I just start breathing like a crazy person. Like I'm a breather. I've come to learn that. And we have other people, they're really insensitive to it. Like it just doesn't, and the plus side is breathing requires energy, right? You have to send blood to your respiratory muscles that otherwise could be going to your leg muscles and helping you run faster. So the thinking is that they're allowing blood to go to the legs that because they're not using it at the lungs, and that would help them with that little bit extra that they would need to be an elite athlete. And so, yeah, it's not clinically low levels, but they're much lower than we would. Like if someone walked into Dr. Dawson or Dr. Lopez's office and they're having blood saturations around 88%, you would go, whoa, something's up. But an elite athlete at maximum exercise, some athletes are like, yeah, they don't know it, right? It's not like a conscious decision, but they just don't. They're still elite athletes and they're still generating huge amounts of ATP, which is powering this huge, fast aerobic running. And they do it in spite of the fact their blood is not as well oxygenated as mine would be at that same level. I have other limitations. I have many limitations. You can call my wife. She'd be happy to share the list. It's on the front and back of a page for sure.
Well, again, thank you for answering or elaborating on some of the points I brought up. I think, obviously, if I didn't bring up my concerns with performance and then rehabilitation from the physiological standpoint, I wouldn't be thinking about what I've encountered myself as an athlete, but also what I recommend for athletes in general. So I really appreciate your insight on that. Does anyone else have any other questions? Oh, good, Gabe.
With that being said, thank you, Dr. Lopez. Thank you, Dr. Gavin. And thank you, everybody, for your thoughtful and wonderful questions. This will conclude week 3 of the Rugby Research and Injury Prevention Group Summer Lecture Series. Again, we would like to give a big thanks to Dr. Tim Gavin for joining us today and everybody in the audience in attendance. Thank you all for attending and taking time out of your day to join us today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for great questions. All of them. All great questions. Thanks so much. Pleasure being here.
Dr. Gavin, we're going to have a few more presentations, but you're more than welcome to stay if you would like to. But we completely understand if you have other responsibilities to go and attend to. Again, thank you for your time and insight today. It was incredibly valuable and very, very thankful for your presence today.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Dr. Gavin.